Divorce, remarriage, that kind of thing. If a person that has never had a spiritual life and had unscriptural marriages, but is no longer in a marriage, does that person's past have a bearing on her ability to be baptized for the remission of her sins and become a child of God? That's question number one. And then the one I want to have combined with it, my family's mother, or my friend's mother, left her father because of violent abuse. They haven't divorced, just separated. Is this okay with God?
Well, the first one, unscriptural marriages, really needs more information as far as giving a real exact answer here. Here's a short answer. Matthew 19:9, Matthew 19:6. If someone is not a Christian, which this implies, if both of the marriages were unscriptural marriages, in other words, they married someone who was married to somebody else, they're in adulterous marriages, then from heaven's perspective, they need to, of course, become a Christian, and they can still be married. They never have been married. I made a comment last couple weeks ago down at College Station, and think about this for a second. I see some frowns. Watch this. Homosexual marriage is now legal, okay? So two guys get married. Or did God join them or not? Matthew 19:6, what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Did God join them? Answer, no, he did not. You meet them, they're good guys, they start coming to church, Brother Bob's preaching, they hear the truth, they come forward and become Christian. What do they have to do? Legally separate, right? You've got that's an unscriptural marriage that they're in, right? So you got to get out of that. You were baptized, you're now both Christian young men who both can still be married because they haven't been married before, so far as in a God-joined marriage. Likewise, come back to heterosexuality. If you have a person who is married to someone else, or a put-away fornicator, someone who is not qualified to have a marriage, and that's who they married, then God doesn't join them either. Matthew 19:6, God does not join fornication, adulterous marriages. So if this person has been married twice, and both those individuals were not scriptural candidates, there's only three categories: those who never have been married, a widow or widower, or an innocent party in a Matthew 19:9 divorce. Then they would become a Christian like everybody else would. Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and then going forward they could remarry. Now, on the other hand, if either of those two marriages were scriptural, let's say the first one, they're late teens, early 20s, they get married to somebody, doesn't work out, they get a non-Matthew 19:9 divorce. They just divorce each other and go on about their way. Then they marry somebody else. That's an unscriptural marriage, of course. And now they're out of that one too. They still have to, the process is the same plan of salvation. However, going forward, they could not be married because they have forfeited that right based on them being a put-away fornicator, based on Matthew 19:9 and that first marriage. So the long and the short of it is this: the only person who can contract a second marriage with God's approval is one who is in a God-ordained, God-joined marriage, Matthew 19:6, he put them together. And then somebody in the marriage committed adultery and was put away for that cause, the innocent party can remarry. That's the short answer. You can do the what ifs and all this, 900 different ways, but that's still the answer to all of them. So like I said, I gave you three scenarios there as to which one it may be. The other question, well, I can't even read that. Well, you see my friend of violence. Certainly, yeah. I actually have a pair of those. I'm really fighting this. You see this Bible right here? I've had this Bible since I was 9. I can't read anymore, so my kids got me a giant print. But every now and then, I could use those readers. But my vanity and pride won't let me wear them in public yet. But anyway, so if Bob would hold that for me. No, it is almost that bad. Violence. You certainly don't have to sit there and let somebody kill you, okay? That is a violation of Matthew 7, verse 12. There's a lot of principles that are being violated in an abusive marriage like that, to where someone might legally even have to get a divorce to legally build a barrier that they have to be protected from that person. However, we're still back to the same principle of the previous point. No secondary marriage would be allowed. So in other words, just because your spouse is abusive, that's not grounds for a second marriage. Adultery is the only grounds given for a second marriage. Not abandonment, not physical violence, not the guys, into whatever stuff you shouldn't be into. Adultery is the grounds. Amen.
I would say also, I believe in part of that question is if this person has been in an unscriptural marriage but now is no longer in a marriage, does that have a bearing on them coming to Christ? No, they can still come to Christ no matter what the situation has been. And Brother Mike, I suppose, addressed that in that saying. But now the second marriage, when you get into that, you have to question what was the previous marriages about. But any sin which a person genuinely repents, can be forgiven, no matter what that sin was. That doesn't necessarily mean, however, that he or she has the right of remarriage. That would depend on the previous situations, which, of course, he has discussed. But, Jesus talked to a woman in Samaria who had had, what, 8 husbands? And the man with whom, or 5 husbands, rather, and with whom, maybe I was thinking about Mickey Rooney.
Yeah.
Someone asked Mickey Rooney one time, said, "Don't you like being married?" He said, "Well, of course I do. I've been married 8 times." Well, but here was a woman who had had 5 husbands, and he said, and the man with whom you now have is not your husband. So you'll run across people, and especially in our society today, and it's first century, and who have been in some unscriptural situations. But if they'll repent, they can come to Christ. Now, whether or not they can form another union, need to find out why they were, what that situation is. And unfortunately, in the abuse situation, we'll find there can be some situations where a person can no longer stay in a situation, literally. I mean, because he might kill her, or the case might be she might kill him. I had a lady one time tell my wife and me, "He will kill me." He came at me with a butcher knife the last time she had a restraining order against him. Well, I'm not about to say, "Well, you're sinning, you need to let this man back in the house." No, he'll kill her. I think that, and in another situation totally different from that, though, we find that if a woman obeyed the gospel and her husband did not want to stay with her because her being a Christian, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he says, "Let him depart." A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Then he didn't say, "Now go out and form another marriage." He said, "Let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband." But it might be the case she could not live with him because he would not live with her unless she gave up Christ. And she could not do that. Well, you've never been so bound to a person that you need to give up Christ in that environment.
I'll look at the second question about the abuse, and I agree with what these guys have said. And Paul, I think, actually deals with this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10. He says, "Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but and if she depart," notice what he says, "let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife." So separation clearly is a biblical principle that there may be a circumstance where you do separate from your spouse. But if there's no fornication involved, Paul says you remain unmarried or you be reconciled. And so if you find yourself in a situation where there is abuse, then certainly you don't have to stay in that marriage and let, as they pointed out, that man kill you. Paul says you can separate, but you remain unmarried. Don't marry someone else or be reconciled to one another. So I think sometimes Christians struggle with this idea of separation. It is a biblical principle. I have an uncle who is deceased that he was a severe alcoholic. His wife told me that he would sometimes get his paycheck, come home, tell her, "I'm going to the store to buy a loaf of bread," and she might not see him for 3 weeks. Severe alcoholic. I don't know what all he did on some of his, when he would get into one of those drunken states, but they remained separated for, I guess, probably 50 years until he died. Neither one of them ever remarried, but they stayed separated for all of that time because, and they were not Christians, by the way. So you've got a circumstance here where they valued the bond of marriage to the point they weren't just going to flippantly get a divorce, but they did separate because of the way he acted. So biblically speaking, there is separation. The Bible allows for that, but you don't go out and get another person. And so, and then on the first question, I think it dealt with, it said they had been in unscriptural marriages. we would need more detail about the unscriptural marriages before we could make any kind of statement about, well, they can marry, they can't marry. You know, if they have been in an unscriptural marriage, they are not in it anymore, then they have forfeited, as far as I can tell, their right to marry at all. But we want people to be baptized, and I think that was the question that it dealt with. How does that affect their baptism? Get them in the water if they're ready. That's what you do. That's any sin. You know, we sometimes think of marriages and homosexuality, and we put them up at a level where that's the worst sin in the world, and sin is sin, folks. And so it doesn't matter what the sin was. They need to be, if they're going to be right with God, they need to be baptized. And so the question was, does this person's past have a bearing on their ability to be baptized? Well, every one of us past has it relates to our bearing. We're in sin. We need to get out of sin and then be baptized, become a child of God. And then we would have to find out the circumstances of those marriages. What are you talking about when you said they were unscriptural marriages? Was it 2, 3? What are we talking about here? So I would say that person needs to obey the gospel, and then we would determine from what they've said about their ability to marry or not marry. But this is dealing with, do I need to become a child of God no matter what my sin is? Yes.
Now, you do have, on separation, don't want to leave the impression here that's a good thing. There's always sin involved. Somebody's in sin, okay? You can't, because you have obligations as married people to each other. You can't just decide to whatever, take off. I've even made this comment to missionaries sometimes, and people don't always think these things out. If you're married, you're going to be kind of long and hard, look at the Bible, find out I can just leave my wife for a year, physically be apart, and I'm going over here, she's going over there. That needs to be thought out a little better than that, as far as even those ramifications. Now, one more thing on this baptism, though. Now, if they're in adultery, if they are in an adulterous marriage, you repent before you're baptized.
That's right.
So, in other words, if that's a situation, you got to get out of it before. But the way the question's worded, I think it was all past tense.
They're no longer in a marriage.
So the question would be, no, you just take care of your business now.
Well, we make a commitment when we get married, don't we?
Yeah.
I tell them that rich or poor, better or worse, it's not multiple choice. It's a huge part.
It's time I drink on that one. That's good.
All right, Brother Bland. Can a faithful member scripturally submit to an eldership where none of the elders are scripturally qualified? And what about a preacher who starts work at such a congregation where such an eldership exists?
Well, that sounds loaded.
It is for
I serve
marriage.
as an elder. This is not from my home congregation, is it?
Did your wife put that?
Yeah, signed by my wife. Can a faithful member scripturally submit to an eldership where none of the elders are scripturally qualified? If the elders are not scripturally qualified, they should no longer be elders. I know it's a whole lot easier to appoint an elder than it is to, quote, disappoint or unappoint an eldership. I don't know how in the world that happens. But if they are unqualified, that would be something, I don't know that I would want to be a member of that congregation if I knew that you've got men who are serving as elders and they're not qualified. Now, what I have to be careful about, let me remember that sin's the transgression of God's law. It's not the transgression of my opinion. Right? How have I determined that these men are not qualified? Is it because, he's not being faithful to his spouse? Is it because he's drinking alcohol and he's doing a lot of other things? Or is it because maybe he and I disagree, or they disagree with me over a point? Maybe a child is no longer at home and is no longer serving faithfully as a Christian, and I've determined that person can no longer serve as an elder, where he's saying, I think I can serve as an elder. So I have to be really sure that the person is not qualified, or that all of the elders are not qualified. I remember a man who called me. They had fired the preacher, and a man called me, and he said, we're going to have a congregational meeting because none of the elders are qualified. My suggestion to him was, don't have a congregational meeting. There's a problem. And I know what happens from congregational meetings. I said, most elders' doors would be open to a civil conversation. But here was my point. I said, if your elders are unqualified, they did not just become unqualified, just simply because they asked the preacher to leave. Okay? I recognize I work for folks. They hired me. They can fire me if they want to. I might not like it, but that shouldn't split the church. So, but if the eldership genuinely is not qualified, you know, Paul says this in 1 Timothy chapter 5. He said, if an elder sin, he's to be rebuked before all. And I think that's down around about verse 20 or something. Against an elder receive not an accusation, but them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear.
19.
I don't believe this verse 19.
And 20.
Okay, 19 and 20. And consequently, I don't believe once an elder, always an elder, is necessarily the case. He might become unqualified. But I just find it very hard sometimes to think that all of them are unqualified. It might be the case, but I just don't think that I'd probably be a part of that congregation. What about a preacher who starts work with such a congregation where such an eldership exists? You know, maybe he's trying to correct it. I would hope if he's a good, sound gospel preacher otherwise, I would hope he's going there to help the situation. How would you have liked to have been the preacher at Corinth? There's a lot of sin involved in the church at Corinth. It would depend again about a preacher who's going there. Why is he going there? Does he really believe that the eldership also is not qualified? Is he going to try to help the situation? Does he think that in some way we can get this on the right track as such? In fact, if the preacher cannot go there, can anybody go there? And so I think all of those things would come into play. But I'd say you've got a very difficult situation if you've got all of the elders are unqualified.
Well, and I agree with what Brother Bland had said in this, and I can answer the second question from personal experience. I actually accepted the work at a congregation, got there, and after about probably a year and a half, there was discussions about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. All three of the elders had children that were in unscriptural marriages. They were defending the children. One lady was, it was the daughter to the elder who attended there, and she was divorced, working for a dentist. The dentist divorced his wife, married this lady, and she had a baby 7 months later, but she always had early babies, is what the dad said. So you've got a situation where I personally thought the men were qualified, and we lasted about 2.5 years working with that congregation, trying to get things right, and then we ended up leaving. So
It wasn't Mabank.
no, it was not Mabank. it was not Mabank. So what do you do when you find yourself in that situation? I can tell you what I did. I tried to work with them, tried to correct, help them see the error of their ways, and eventually it was time for us to leave. And it was kind of funny because one of the elders, we were getting ready to leave, and he had spread a lot of false stuff about me. And so he and his wife show up. We're packing to leave. And they said, can we sit down and talk? So we're sitting there talking, and we're just talking. And the lady looks at her husband and said, JW, are you going to say it? And so we talked a little bit longer, and she said, JW, right now. And so then he repented. He said, I'm so sorry the way I treated you. But it took his wife jabbing him about 5 times to get him to do it. So as preachers, you sometimes walk into circumstances you don't know. Then the first question, can a faithful member scripturally submit to an eldership where none of the elders are scripturally qualified. I would agree with what Billy was saying on this. I would have to know, how did you determine they were unscripturally qualified? Or they were scripturally not qualified? How did you come to that determination? And then the question kind of where I was, why would you want to stay there if they are all, because these men were allowing false teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage to be propagated in the classrooms, in the foyer. There was a guy handing out tracts on marriage, divorce, Olin Hicks and some of those guys. And so why would you want to stay there if you've determined that they are truly not scripturally qualified? I would kind of be like, I would try to work with them, get through the circumstance, but there's going to be a point where you say, I can't stay and be a part of this.
You know, couple of things. This is an issue that probably should be preached on, probably in a lectureship one of these days, but the whole thing is on installation of elders, elders' issues, and removal. Yes. The Bible typically gets ignored on this topic. You know, we've had all kinds of big issues over the last 20 years about should we reaffirm and vote on elders, this, that, and other. That doesn't come up if the Bible is followed. If it's a matter of sin, just like any other member, and I'm an elder also, and you're not bulletproof. In other words, if you sin, someone should come to you at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's confirmed. You go to the elder and you say, hey, what you're teaching or what you're doing here is a sin. If I don't repent, Matthew 18 kicks in. What happened? What they just said. Then you go before the congregation and say, you know what? He's no longer qualified to be an elder here. He's a false teacher. The same way, I see it more usually on elders when it comes to getting old. And not that you can't be old to be an elder. Look at but
what did they say?
But listen, most of us, if we live long enough, our capacity is going to slip. One of the greatest things I ever heard of an elder out in West Texas, west of me, and I met with him, we were just talking in general. He's 87 years old. But a few years ago, he said he's still got his mind, he's sharp as a tack. But he said, he got in the pulpit on a Sunday morning. He said, brethren, listen to me now. Hear me now and believe what I'm going to say later. When the time comes, if I am no longer mentally or physically capable, especially mentally capable, of doing the job of an elder, then these other two men, their job will be to get up here and tell you, we love brother so-and-so, he's been a great servant here, but he simply can no longer serve as an elder. He said, I'm telling you that today in my voice, because on that day, I won't feel that way. I'll be so, oh no, I can still do it, they don't love me, whatever, see? So, but you have to think about this. It is not a lifetime endowment that is bestowed upon you until death. You serve as long as you can serve, the need is there, and the qualifications are met. So, but I would also point out that the qualifications would primarily either be a matter of sin, doctrine as mentioned over there a moment ago, or a capacity. Either simply cannot or will not. Sometimes other things are involved. You have a sick spouse, you have other issues, again, as we age, to where they never at a meeting, never at the work of the church, can't do the job. Now, why can't other elders go over there? I think everybody who's ever served as one, wouldn't you raise your hand to the fact that if our time comes and we cannot do the job, should we not step down or be removed? Yeah. Yes, we should. So why don't we? Again, because it's not a shame. Maybe if we preached on it more from that standpoint of, there's a start time and a finish time to these things. You're either going to die or become incapacitated, at which time they step out. As a congregation, I would say the congregation that is there is not scriptural faithful either. Or you'd already approached your unfaithful elders. Is that thing about the elders? That's funny. They were good enough elders when they hired you. I've got this preachers. I left there. Those guys don't want to hear the truth. Well, they hired you. So, they can't, they're rotten, pitiful people now, but 3 years ago, oh, it's the best church in the world. I'm moving there and I'm all excited. Well, which is it, So sometimes our perspective can kind of get in the way on those things. And as far as preachers, and by the way, I don't brag on Kerry a whole lot to him, but we're good friends and been back going a long time. He and I have one other friend, both. Well, they've got 2 friends. But their kids are up around the house, and to me, they almost specialize in being willing to go to congregations with problems. And there's a need for that. And then the reason you don't have kids is you may get less than 6 months. But to be able to go somewhere and to know going in, there are some serious issues here, but we're going to try to make a change here, try to help. Brethren, don't get the mentality that we only go preach where they don't need us, right? You take the gospel where people are in sin and need the truth, and you go to congregations, everybody, I want to go to a really good, sound, solid scriptural church that pays real good and takes care of the preacher and everything's wonderful. Well, okay, but they can do that without you, right? Maybe you need to go to the place that has a lot of warts and problems, but with the influence of the gospel and a patient hand, maybe something good comes out of a hard situation. So again, just like they said, make sure it's a matter of sin and not just, well, they're not doing things the way I want to do it. That's why we have elders. Everything elders do, all of it, is matter of opinion. It's all expediency. You understand that? God sets the law. They dictate how we're going to apply the principles of the Scriptures. Just because they do it differently than you do, that's the very nature of the beast. It's a matter of expediency.
Due to time constraints, just one more question very quickly, okay? Brother Carey, do you believe that Cornelius was in a lost condition prior to being taught the truth?
Very quickly, did you say? I don't think that question goes with very quickly qualifications. Let's look at Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10, and the question was, do I believe Cornelius was lost before the gospel was preached to him? Is that the question? Let's notice Dr. Luke's discussion of this man. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band, a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he had looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. Now send for a preacher. I'll just end it right there. Send for a preacher. In John 9 and verse 31, the Bible says God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners. So what I understand with Cornelius is that you have a man, we talked about it in the first question that was asked about the Gentiles being under the patriarchal law. What I see is a man who was worshiping God faithfully under the patriarchal law. And again, Luke is inspired of God to write these words about it. He's a devout man. He fears God. He gives alms to the people. He prays to God. God answers his prayer. So I believe you have a man who is faithfully serving God under the patriarchal law. That law is now over. And so the gospel must be preached, and he has an opportunity to either reject the gospel or accept the gospel. And we know with a man like that heart what he's going to do. He obeyed the gospel and now becomes a New Testament Christian. So we're dealing with a time period that is very unique. You've got God taking the Jewish law, which had been the law for the nation of Israel for 1,500 years. He is now giving a new law. What about the 120 in Acts chapter 1? Here you've got a group of people who had stayed with Jesus Christ through thick and thin. They are now, I believe, the nucleus of the church when she's established. Now you've got a guy named Cornelius who's in that very same, he's in a God-given religion, and now it's changed where you've got to obey the gospel now. So I would say Cornelius was a saved man who needed to hear the gospel in a new dispensation.
We ask the wrong question sometimes. What's the point of that question? I mean, I have a pretty strong view on this too. What's the point? We're in a transitional period, okay? Things are not the same today as they were then. If somebody's trying to argue you can be saved and not be a Christian, you can be saved in the patriarchy, no, you can't.
You can't.
No more than Judaism, okay? And even some of our comments, we're the same church today they were in the first century. We are, but there were some elements present then that aren't here now. We don't have apostles now. We don't have miracles now. We've got elders and deacons in a way they didn't have early on. We have a written testament where they had oral. So there are some changes. Now, it's the same church. But sometimes people get very myopic and focus on things that really there's not a whole lot of reason to. And I'm going to show you a beautiful artistic rendering here, okay? But this is about the best explanation, I think, of all of this material. Acts chapter 2. These are three boats, okay? You have the boat of Christianity, the boat of Judaism, the boat of patriarchy. There are holes in the boats of Judaism and patriarchy. There are folks on the boat of Judaism that are safe currently, but it's about to go down. Acts chapter 2, the boat of Christianity pulls up. The gospel is preached. Had there been faithful Jews there that weren't necessarily themselves involved in Christ's crucifixion, they got there that morning, they were in a safe state. Had they rejected Peter's message and stayed with Judaism, they would have died. If they were baptized that day in Jerusalem, mama, daddy, grandpa, everybody back to the house would still be saved under Judaism. There is a time frame here where the gospel is coming to them, at which time when they got it, they'd be accountable for it. That is not parallel to today. Nobody today is in that scenario. Same thing with Cornelius. Acts chapter 10, it lays out the passage. Again, a guy that seems to be, everything's right with God under patriarchy, but patriarchy is drowning. It's going out of the way. So either he would follow what Peter says, become a child of God, and be saved and go to glory, or he would die. That to me is about as simple illustration as I could come up with. Technically, Ephesians 2:14 and Colossians 2, I've reversed that. Colossians 2:14, Ephesians 2:15. Technically, when Christ died, the old law died. When he resurrected, the New Testament Christianity was born. And not a soul on this earth was accountable to it. Not one for over 50 days. Yep. Until he revealed it, okay? So it's a transmission issue. God didn't hold them accountable until he actually got it to them. We know by the time Paul finishes Colossians, the whole world had heard the gospel. So this question really is irrelevant other than a nice mental exercise. There's some value to it, but I've heard people fight and argue over this thing for years. And the fact is, it is a question that only applies during that first generation. The answer truly is, no matter what his state was, to go to heaven, he had to become a Christian. Same is true of those Jews. Though I would probably argue, if it pressed on it, I think both categories were in a safe state. But they're not going to be very long. And that they wouldn't have been the day Peter walked out the door. If he'd left, they'd have been lost. Brother Bland?
Well, obviously time is of the essence here, and I agree, and I think possibly the best thing to do is, like Brother Mike said, we're not in that situation today. We can argue back and forth, I suppose. My personal view is those boats went down at the time of the giving of the law of Christ, Acts 11:15. That's when the beginning began, according to Acts 11:15. I look at Cornelius, Acts 11:14, who shall hear words whereby thou and all thy house shall be saved. I've heard Brother Guy in Woods discuss it, how, again, taking the same position that Brother Gary just mentioned. He believed that patriarchy went up to Acts 10. I've got a problem personally thinking that you've got a universal law with a patriarchy system going on. But be that as it may, it's kind of like people want to argue about what happened to those people from the cross to the day of Pentecost who were under John's baptism and things of that nature. And we can go back and forth. I think there's a correct answer to it, but I think it would be much more time involved. And when we got through, I think we might say, that's interesting.
Well, and that's the point. Romans 14, we have an obligation to respect each other in matters of opinion. You can argue this 3 or 4 different ways, and decent arguments can be made both ways, but it doesn't matter either way to us today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to express our appreciation, Brother Michael, Brother Bland, and Brother Clark for conducting our panel. I think you've done an excellent job. Appreciate the work you did. We're going to be dismissed now till 6 o'clock. We'll come back for a period of singing, and then at 6:30 we'll be discussing the existence of God, internal evidences by Brother Richard Stevens. Consider yourself dismissed.